everyone. My name's Tim Wyatt. I'm an esoteric writer, researcher, publisher, and filmmaker from Yorkshire in England. And I've spent most of my life researching the many, many different aspects of the ageless wisdom. And today we're really going to be dealing with one of the favorite topics of mine, which is death and all its related aspects, including reincarnation, and of course, that mighty law of laws, the law of karma. But let's start with the words of the well-known filmmaker and comedian Woody Allen, who said, "I didn't believe in reincarnation in my last life, and I don't believe it in this one either." And that, in some ways, sums up people's very paradoxical attitude to the question of rebirth. Now, I've called this talk "Why Reincarnation is Making a Comeback," and I mean that here in the West, in America, in Europe, where I live. Because when I was born back in the early 1950s, we'd conducted an opinion survey in the United States or here in Europe and asked respondents, do you believe in reincarnation? Those believing in rebirth would have represented a very, very tiny minority. So how things have changed over the past 70 years. Now, almost a third of Americans, according to the latest figures I checked, believe reincarnation to be a reality in some form or another. However, before we get into all this, let's be precise as to what we mean by reincarnation. This particular term was introduced into the English language in the mid-19th century. And when you literally translate it from its Latin roots, it means the process of coming into flesh again. But what exactly comes back into flesh again? Certainly not the same transient personality as last time round, but a different one. So, as we know in Theosophy, what remains constant from birth to birth is our unchanging or slowly changing individuality, that eternal part of ourselves we call a soul, and which consists of our higher minds, our wisdom, intuition, and spirit, that higher triad. So there are many other terms for rebirth, such as palingenesis, which is derived from the Greek and means, again, new birth. And then there's another term which floats around with regularity, which is metempsychosis. This was introduced into the English language in the 16th century, and again is derived from Greek, and it means, in a very long-winded way, the process by which the soul gets changed after death into a new body. And this is a term used in some traditions to suggest that humans can be reborn in other kingdoms of nature, such as a tree or an animal. Well, of course, in Theosophy, we don't accept this idea at all. Our view is that once a soul has individualized from the group souls of the animal kingdom into the individualized souls of the human kingdom, there's no going back. Once a human, always a human. So we can't revert to being a horse or a daffodil, as enticing as those prospects might be. And staying with Greek, there's another term which is sometimes used, metempsychosis, which means the process of coming back into a body. So we see all these terms which are actually very similar. And then there are more generalized terms such as transmigration, which means the process of traversing the realm of death into a new body. So it's apparent that over the past 7 decades, there's been a major change in outlook here in the West, with increasing numbers of people subscribing to notions of rebirth. Just the way most of our ancestors have done down the ages. And so I think it is fair to say that reincarnation is most certainly making a comeback. Now, reincarnation has featured prominently and indeed centrally in numerous different cultures and religions and spiritual traditions across the millennia, most notably in Hinduism, and in Buddhism from Asia. But significantly, ideas of reincarnation are entirely absent in the three Abrahamic religions of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, although it's fair to say that the esoteric parts of these religions probably still do retain these ideas. So we in the Western world of the 21st century are one of the few groups in history which doesn't wholly embrace ideas of rebirth. But of course, right now, in the world that we live in, we're obsessed with this immediate gratification culture of the here and now. Our mindset is dominated almost exclusively by a materialistic paradigm in which the physical world is the only reality. And the guiding mantra behind all this is what you perceive with your physical senses is all there is. There's nothing else. If you can't see it, it doesn't exist. I should point out, of course, that our physical senses are extremely limited, and certain plants and animals have better senses of feeling and smelling and hearing than we do. And certainly some birds have far better eyesight. So this physical only view largely dictates our consciousness, and it dominates most science, which itself has become a new religion of scientific materialism, otherwise known as scientism. And scientism essentially denies the existence of such things as soul or spirit. These things cannot be measured or tested in laboratories. But could it be the case that this, what seems to be a dramatic increase in the numbers of people believing in reincarnation, does it amount to a rejection of this prevailing and cold materialistic logic? Or is it a reaction against religions even? Could it even represent a kind of spiritual rebellion or even renaissance? Are people becoming weary of this solely material world and a supposedly random mechanical universe without purpose, meaning, or design? Are people becoming weary with these ideas? Are they searching to rediscover those lost, timeless truths buried deep in the ageless wisdom traditions? Are they beginning to sense that the conventional scientific and Christian explanations are flawed or limited or just plain wrong? A recent survey, very interesting this, by the highly respected American Pew Research Organization, who I've been following for many years now, found that when they did various surveys, 33% of all American adults believe in reincarnation in some form. Among younger respondents, those aged 18 to 29, this figure rose to 40%. And interestingly, far more women believe in reincarnation than men, 38% as opposed to 27%. Now, despite Christianity having outlawed reincarnation as one of its anathemas 15 centuries ago, many of its contemporary followers don't always toe the party line as far as this particular topic is concerned. Around 30% of American Christians believe in reincarnation in some form, but there are huge variations. While 47% of Hispanic Catholics believe in rebirth, only a third of that number, 16% of evangelicals, believe that they'll be born again in new bodies. So the long-standing assertions of the church seem to be widely disregarded by many of its faithful. However, religion doesn't seem to be the only deciding factor here, since 44% of those, quote, who believe in nothing in particular, unquote, embrace reincarnation. 44% of people who don't believe in anything believe in reincarnation, as do 32% of agnostics. And even 12% of self-confessed atheists believe that they'll be back on Earth sometime in new bodies. So I suggest that reincarnation, and indeed notions of spirituality itself, is no longer the exclusive property of religions. People do seem to be developing their own ideas outside the religious sphere. Obviously, a lot of people still do adhere to religions, but these links seem to be loosening as we move from one cycle into another. The story of how and why Christianity outlawed the doctrine of rebirth is a really intriguing story, if not a somewhat sordid saga of bigotry and political intrigue, as well as sexual promiscuity and even murder. As we'll see, it was a very, very complicated story which unfolded over a number of centuries. And there's no doubt that when Jesus was on his 3-year mission in the Holy Land, reincarnation, and of course, karma, the law of cause and effect, were part of his core teachings. And the Bible, when you pick into it and start to look deep into it, is replete with references to rebirth. I won't quote all the references, but he that findeth his life shall lose it, and he that loseth his life for my sake shall find it. That's Matthew. Gospel of John. My Father's house has many mansions. If that were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. And in the Old Testament book of Isaiah, thy dead men shall live. Together with my dead body shall they arise. Awake and sing, and earth shall cast out the dead. And there are many, many more examples of this. Now, this is where the politics comes in, because in the 3rd century, one of the early influential Christian theologians, Origen of Alexandria, strongly reaffirmed the pre-existence of the soul prior to rebirth, suggesting reincarnation. And he wrote, "Every soul comes into this world strengthened by the victories or weakened by the defeats of the previous life. The providence of God, which governs the universe with justice, also rules immortal souls with the merits and motives of each individual." Couldn't be clearer than that. And shortly after this, one of the early Christian saints, Gregory, was completely unequivocal about reincarnation when he said, "It's absolutely necessary that the soul should be healed and purified. And if this does not take place during this time on earth, it must be accomplished in future lives." So nothing could be clearer than that. However, by the 4th century, the situation had changed rather dramatically, and the church fathers, who seem to have been rather more intent on controlling the masses than in promoting soul growth or spiritual evolution, had begun to demonize believers in reincarnation. They demonized these people as dangerous and independent free thinkers who were somehow beyond ecclesiastical control. And the first officially sanctioned attack against reincarnation came at the First Council of Nicaea in the year 325. And this led to tampering with documents which made up the New Testament. Official correctors were brought in to restore orthodoxy to the scriptures. And by the time of the Constantinople Synod, 2 centuries later in 543, further restrictions were placed on even discussing the question of reincarnation. And 4 of Origen's beliefs about death and rebirth were declared as anathemas. And so the final death knell, I suppose, for reincarnation came just a decade later in 553 AD at the Second Council of Constantinople. And this had been convened by the Byzantine Emperor Justinian and was meant to resolve various church matters, including the pre-existence of the soul. But it was also a highly politicized event designed to give Constantinople a firm grip over Rome. And the Pope, Viglius, who was actually living in Constantinople at the time, didn't even bother to attend this meeting due to threats of violence against him. And the voting was somewhat skewed because the council consisted of 159 bishops from the East, but only 6 from the West. And then there is another twist to this interesting story, and it involves a woman, an ambitious sexual predatress called Theodora, who was the tough-minded and very manipulative wife of Emperor Justinian. And in her early life, she'd been a very ruthless political operator and intriguer, and also gained notoriety for her promiscuity. And so she lavished favors on her faithful followers, but she condemned her enemies to death, including, it is said, a staggering 500 former lovers. So obviously for her, very dominant personality, reincarnation became a very unattractive proposition for her, since it meant she'd have to atone for all these excesses of sex and murder at some point in the future. So in what was a monumentally flawed piece of political theatre, she was pivotal in turning this doctrine of reincarnation into the heresy it finally became, in which it's remained for the last millennium and a half. So from that moment on, it was one life only, followed by a purifying stint in purgatory, or a descent into the eternal fiery depths of hell, or if you've been a good person, everlasting peace in heaven, or one of God's waiting rooms somewhere. How differently world history might have been had the early church not retained its original views on reincarnation. And might we ask, as whether part of some future resurrection or modification or evolution of the Christian church, reincarnation might be rehabilitated and restored to its canon of belief, because clearly many of its followers do believe in these ideas. So despite the fact that increasing numbers of people in the West, for all sorts of different reasons, possibly the cultural changes of the 60s and 70s, despite the fact that many more people do believe this, do they also understand that reincarnation is just one side of the coin? Are they aware that rebirth itself, without some organizing and moderating principle, would be utterly meaningless? It would just be a random succession of lives with no purpose, and the purpose of life is to evolve, and so there has to be some underpinning principle. And so the other side of the coin, of course, is that universal law of cause and effect, which we mentioned a few moments ago, known as the law of karma. This is sometimes described as the law of laws, or the law of retribution, and many other names too. So it's the karma accrued from past lives which not only shapes our current lives, but also dictated how, when, and where we were born. It's been pivotal in our choosing our parents, our circumstances, and our health, and much else besides. People outside the esoteric circles will probably find that quite difficult to understand. Now, karma is derived from the Sanskrit verb kri, which means to make or to do, so it suggests action of some kind. When I was born, back in the early 50s, karma was a word that was virtually unknown in the English language outside a few religious and scholarly circles. And it crept in during the counterculture of the 1960s as Eastern spiritual influences began percolating in all sorts of different ways into Western culture. Musicians like John Lennon popularized the idea with songs such as Instant Karma. So although embedded in our current language and indeed our thoughts, the word karma is widely misunderstood and it's widely misused. And to some people, it only applies to things that happen in this life only, since they don't believe that there are other lives, but they still use the word to describe the cause and effect in this particular life. But the only way that karma can really be understood is in terms of a wider continuum consisting of numerous lives in different bodies, with different personalities, in different epochs, with different socio-economic circumstances. And the karma each of us is trying to resolve right now, the stuff that we're working through in the present life, might be the result of things we indulged in during a previous life as a French peasant or an African king or a Chinese foot soldier. Or it may be something resulting from the life before that one even, or even further back in the chain of rebirths. Of course, since most of us are ignorant of our past appearances in physical form, working out precisely how and why we arrived here in our current lives is extremely difficult, if not impossible. We'll see that there are potential ways of accessing this knowledge, but it's far from easy. People do often have spontaneous insights into previous lives. But another question here, does this wider acceptance of rebirth and to a lesser degree karma, does it modify the way people behave and conduct themselves? If they know that they will immediately reap the rewards or the retribution for their actions, does this make them somehow more responsible? And might it engender a deeper morality? Does it make people realize that their thoughts and words and deeds will have repercussions in this or another life somewhere down the line? Well, looking at the way the world is right now, I mean, I think it's, you could be forgiven for being quite skeptical about this, but I'll leave it for you to decide. Certainly the way that things are and the way that people behave irresponsibly in every way doesn't seem to give us much hope, but, maybe there are. Sometimes you're driving around and you see bumper stickers on cars which bear the slogan, "Life isn't a rehearsal." But in some ways, that's exactly what it is. It's not a rehearsal for this life, but each life is a rehearsal in the sense that if the purpose of life is developing into something greater and more sophisticated via cyclic evolution, then each life isn't only a consequence of previous ones, it's also a preparation for the next one. And given the fact that we don't get things right for much of the time, in that sense, we practice things until we do get them right. So in that sense, it is a rehearsal. In some Eastern cultures where belief in reincarnation has been ubiquitously accepted for many millennia, there's the accusation sometimes that karma can lead to a kind of fatalism or indeed a kind of lethargy. And the idea which prevails here is that since everything is rigidly predestined somehow and unchangeably set in stone, then we could and should do nothing to interfere with that celestial diktat. In extreme cases, this leads to a situation where, for example, someone comes across a person badly injured in a car crash. But instead of helping that person, they choose to walk on by with the mistaken justification that to intervene would be to interfere with the victim's karma. Now, this, as far as I'm concerned, is complete nonsense. The reality is, isn't it, that helping others will inevitably be included on the positive rather than the negative side of the karmic balance sheet whenever that's read. So to go off at a slight tangent for a moment, it might be useful to mention another key and often overlooked aspect of reincarnation and karma. And this is when it manifests not just in individual, but in collective form. I think often we become obsessed with the idea of our own individual karma and don't look beyond into a wider continuum. So this collective form is very, very interesting, and there's much evidence to suggest that our choice of era, location, and circumstances for each new life isn't just the result of individual karma or soul choice. Obviously, There are the lords of karma who oversee this process and play a crucial and mysterious role in it all, especially assisting probably lesser evolved souls to choose an appropriate life and possibly to achieve specific goals in that individual life. But there's another factor at work here, and this is the existence of what we might call soul groups. Soul groups. And these are not to be confused with the group souls which exist in the animal and plant kingdom. So, to repeat, animals and plants have yet to reach a point where they have individualized souls. They still have group souls and will have that until somewhere in the far distant era. And they belong to group souls of varying size, and the more sophisticated the animal, the smaller the soul group to which they belong. But in the human kingdom, all individuals seem to also belong to groups of souls, and they seem to be long established collectives of souls who agree to repeatedly reincarnate together in a number of different lives. And in each new life, members of these groups take on different roles, often in a family scenario. It's almost, you could see it as a traveling theatre company, with the actors regularly taking on new and varied roles as they put on different performances in different towns. For example, in one life, individual A is my father. In another life, she's my sister or uncle or some other member of the family. In one life, individual A may be my closest associate, and in another, my worst enemy. So we can see that these roles and groupings change over time. So it appears that in the after-death states, somehow, in a process which I don't understand, members of these soul groups make collective agreements for new arrangements following what we might just call a karmic script, which they have written. However, cynics might say that if these soul groups exist, why aren't we more aware of them then? Well, we probably are, to tell you the truth. Each of us experiences situations where we're instantly attracted to other people in various ways, intellectually, sexually, via common interests, or in other ways too. Equally, sometimes we're absolutely repelled or irrationally angered by someone. And this often happens immediately without our even interacting with this other person. Could it be that we've had positive or negative dealings with that soul group in some other life? Might this person even feature in our own soul group in some way? So a growing body of people believe in rebirth, even when mainstream thought continues to dismiss this idea as illogical, unscientific, or primitive wishful thinking. But what has persuaded these number of people to change their view? Well, if we accept the premise that the soul's purpose is to develop and over time grow into a more refined entity, then this clearly is an extremely prolonged process. One life, or even 100, wouldn't be enough to fulfill a fraction of this task, especially if a particular individual led a very short life. So, in my opinion, it's the assertion that you get only one life, which is deeply illogical. It's meaningless when you start to even probe its logic. There is none. So when you dig around, there's actually a surprising amount of evidence for reincarnation. And yet, even this fails to persuade the hardcore materialists and those who believe that this life is the only life they'll ever get. But of course, persuading these people is always going to be difficult because materialists always demand physical proof of a process which is essentially non-physical and which occurs in the more refined states of reality, more refined states which they don't believe in anyway. So perhaps this growing body of often physical evidence does have an effect on those starting to question this one life only assertion. And I think people start to do this often as they get older. Possibly one of the most powerful indications is that of personal intuition, that overwhelming certainty that you've somehow been here and lived on earth before, employing that sixth theosophical principle which we talk about, buddhi, that direct input of knowledge beyond the intellect. This happened to me at the age of 8. In the middle of a game of football in the school playground, that's English football, not American football, by the way, I suddenly stopped playing and just withdrew to the sidelines and had this very strange experience. And I was overcome with this deep knowledge, this intuition, this overwhelming certainty that I'd been here before, not as Tim Wyatt, but as someone else, although obviously I had no idea of who that might have been. Now, when I tried to communicate these ideas to my parents, to my teachers, and to the local priest, they nearly always immediately tried to change the subject. So many people do get sudden flashes or insights into past lives, and this can happen spontaneously, but may be triggered by all kinds of circumstances, trauma, anxiety, high emotion, or other altered states of consciousness. Sometimes these memories can be triggered artificially. Often people dismiss these revelations as mere fantasy or daydreaming and don't take them seriously. But often they happen at times of high emotion when people seem to literally step outside their bodies. And it's happened to me. Since the 1950s, psychologists and psychotherapists and others have conducted many thousands of past life regression sessions in many different countries, often for therapeutic reasons, but often with absolutely fascinating results and revelations. And what they've shown has been very, very revealing. Indeed, some of these sessions have cured people of persistent diseases by unearthing what appeared to be the karmic roots of their illness. And these particular regressions seem to show that there is a big link between karma and disease. Now, past life regression involves individuals being hypnotized and taken back to previous incarnations. And what's really interesting about this is that in quite a lot of cases, participants are able to provide very precise, detailed, and verifiable recall of events, places, food, clothing, medical techniques, industrial techniques, arts and crafts, all sorts of things like that. Often more detailed knowledge than acknowledged experts in those fields actually have. Some years ago, I underwent 3 of these sessions myself and recalled a number of lives covering more than 3,000 years. Although it was an interesting experience, my personal feeling is that these insights shouldn't always be taken too literally. And I think that some of them may be more symbolic than actual. And I think also when you're getting into these inner realms, there is always the danger of picking up things which are not necessarily about yourself, but entities outside yourself. But a number of other things emerge from these regression sessions. For example, in sessions conducted by the Canadian psychiatrist, Dr. Joel Witten, significant numbers of people reported the importance of soul groups and the continuing involvement of other souls. Sometimes for different reasons, souls were unwilling to incarnate unless other pivotal souls could also be involved. Now, intriguing insights about the post-mortem states can also be gained from the growing number of near-death experiences, or NDEs, which have been reported and studied over the past few decades. And these have obviously become much more common in recent times as medical science has developed new ways of keeping people alive who in previous eras and times would have died. And there are countless cases, especially during operations, of patients leaving their bodies and floating upwards and watching the surgeons at work. And often those who were supposedly deeply anesthetized with no brain function at all, supposedly, they report being able to see everything and floating above the operating table. And on many occasions, patients have reported conversations of the medical team accurately, or watched specific incidents such as a surgeon dropping an instrument on the floor. One of the most fascinating and persuasive accounts of an NDE comes from the prominent American neurosurgeon, Dr. Aben Alexander, and some of you will have heard of him. He's become very well known thanks to his best-selling book, Proof of Heaven, in which he describes in absolute graphic detail what happened after he suffered from a rare form of bacterial meningitis and was plunged into a deep coma which lasted for a week. And although his brain wasn't functioning at all, he suddenly found himself in another world where he went on this 7-day adventure, going through different realms and strata of consciousness, communing with non-physical entities and traversing through various different landscapes. And what makes all this particularly interesting is that prior to his brush with death, Dr. Alexander had regarded himself purely as a man of science with no spiritual perspective whatsoever. Like a great many people, though, who undergo an NDE, Dr. Alexander emerged with an entirely different perspective on life. And like many others, indeed, like most other people who go through these experiences, he returned with no fear of death whatsoever. In fact, during these experiences, it's quite common. People are taken into this wonderful landscape, sometimes by family members or wise beings or others. They're taken through this landscape to a point where there is some kind of boundary, a wall or a stream or some other physical barrier. And they're told, now you have to go back. It's not your time to be here. I don't want to go back. It's much nicer here than back on Earth. No, it's your time. And people are persuaded that they have to return to their Earth bodies until the appointed time when they do move on. But often during NDEs, there are very common features to these things. People find themselves bathed in brilliant light, in beautiful landscapes, with family members or spiritual beings, and they're taken on a journey. You know, it's always a journey to reveal something. And then they're always told, you have to go back. One man who studied these things extensively was a man called Dr. Melvin Morse. And he commented on the universality of NDEs. And he wrote, it doesn't matter who has the experience, Marines, punk rockers, real estate agents, corporate executives, housewives, ministers, or holy men, they're all transformed by their exposure to the light. So this is fascinating. What's happening here is universal and transcends culture and religion and probably time as well. Now, while NDEs themselves don't offer cast iron proof of life after death or reincarnation, they do seem to indicate very positively that consciousness can and does operate even when the brain isn't functioning. But of course, mainstream science and evolutionary biologists don't like this idea at all. They seem to insist that mind is a byproduct, an epiphenomenon of the brain. And they don't like the idea that consciousness, mind, can exist outside the brain. But then, of course, these scientists can't even define what consciousness is other than this byproduct of neurochemical activity in the brain. Now, although not precisely the same as NDEs, out-of-the-body experiences also often share some of the same characteristics as NDEs, and these can also happen to people spontaneously at times of trauma or for other reasons, or can be induced through visualization, meditation, and other techniques. But there's other evidence too that we've been here before and will probably be here again, and which supports the idea of reincarnation. We're all aware of people displaying remarkable talent or genius from an early age. One of the classic examples often quoted is Mozart, who began his composing career at the age of 4 and produced his first opera by the age of 7. Well, how do childhood prodigies like him acquire such skills after only a few months' life on Earth? Could it be that Mozart and others like him, other geniuses, Leonardo da Vinci, Isaac Newton, Nikola Tesla, picked up and honed their abilities in previous lives and transferred them to their current lives? There's another comparatively rare but interesting phenomenon known as xenoglossy, where people suddenly start speaking in languages with which they're completely unfamiliar. And sometimes these are obscure or dead dialects from the distant past, or just spoken in some royal palace somewhere. Is that part of a past life recall? Many people have deep-seated fears and phobias about all kinds of things: spiders, open spaces, heights, or the color purple. And these often appear very irrational because they can't be linked to any apparent trauma in the person's current life. So could these fears be the emotional residue of convulsive events in previous lives involving war or imprisonment, violent death, or other trauma? Another interesting factor is when people seem to feel a resonance and an attachment or a déjà vu with a particular place when visiting it, often for the first time. They may also equally feel repelled by a particular location. But in some cases, people visiting a new city seem to intuitively know its layout and are able to describe specific buildings or negotiate unfamiliar streets. This isn't conclusive evidence again, but it also suggests that memories of places leave lasting imprints from life to life. Scars, traces of wounds, birthmarks, or persistent pains may perhaps reflect injuries sustained in previous lives, or even the cause of death itself. For example, someone who was hanged or beheaded may carry over that neck pain into a subsequent life. Over a 40-year period, the pioneering American psychiatrist Dr. Ian Stevenson investigated more than 3,000 cases of children who claimed to remember past lives. Many of these children lived in India. In one study, which ran to a monumental 2,200 pages, he identified 200 cases where birthmarks on children corresponded to wounds from guns and bladed weapons inflicted on the person the child remembers being in a past life. And in 17 of those cases, medical and police records, along with autopsy reports, established that the child had indeed died in the way that they claimed. So that's just another sliver of proof. There's much else besides that we could talk about, but in recent decades, many prominent individuals have firmly believed in reincarnation. We've already mentioned John Lennon, and he believed that he and his wife Yoko Ono had once been Napoleon Bonaparte and Josephine. And Lennon, interestingly, in his own unique way, described as death as being no more important than getting out of one car and getting into another. But on the note of cars, we'll leave the final word to that innovative manufacturer, Henry Ford, who was a firm believer in reincarnation. And he said, "Until I discovered this theory, I was unsettled and dissatisfied, without a compass, so to speak. When I discovered reincarnation, it was as if I'd found a universal plan. I realized there was a chance to work out my ideas. Time was no longer limited. I was no longer a slave to the hands of the clock. There was time enough to plan and create. I wouldn't give 5 cents for seeing all the world, because I feel there is nothing in the 5 continents and on the 5 seas that I have not somehow seen." And on that note, thank you very much indeed for listening.